Good evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Rebecca Westerfield, a trustee of the World Affairs Council and your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's very distinguished guests. Salil Shetty joined Amnesty International as the organization's 8th Secretary General in July 2010. A long-term activist on poverty and justice, Shetty leads the movement's worldwide work to end human rights violations. Prior to joining Amnesty International, Shetty was director of the United Nations Millennium Campaign from 2003 to 2010. He played a pivotal role in building the global advocacy campaign for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. From 1998 to 2003, he was chief executive of Action Aid and is credited with transforming the organization into one of the world's foremost international development NGOs. Mr. Shetty studied at the Indian Institute of Management and also at the London School of Economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Salil Shetty. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all for joining us here this evening. So it's good to see a lot of young people in the audience as well. I'm sure that on the technical side of law and human rights, Rebecca and many others in the room know a lot more about it than I do. I'm very much from an activist stock, so I'm hoping that I'll touch on some of the big issues that the world is facing in human rights terms. And I have some colleagues here from the national chapter of Amnesty, the United States section. So if there were more US-focused questions, I'm sure they'll jump to my rescue. I'm not an expert on US issues. But it's really a pleasure to speak at the World Affairs Council. Thank you for inviting me to address you here this evening in the city where the UN Charter itself was signed. I know that Amnesty International has a very vital presence in the Bay Area, and I hope that perhaps some of you in this room today are already supporters or members of Amnesty International. Indeed, I understand that human rights activist Janetta Sagan founded the first chapter of Amnesty International in this country out of her living room in Atherton here in the Bay Area. So it's great to be in this venue, in this city. I was asked, in terms of the topic for today's subject, I was asked to give my take on the state of human rights in the world today, which is a tall order, so I'm going to try and do what I can. But I wanted to approach the subject by looking at some of the things which, some of the challenges we're facing, but also some of the opportunities. So let me start with some of the difficult challenges we are facing today. And there are more than enough reasons, of course, for us to be circumspect about the state of human rights in the world today. As the reports that Amnesty International publishes almost on a weekly basis will make it very clear. But let me take some of the most obvious examples. And I was saying to Rebecca inside, she was asking me, or a couple of them were asking me, what keeps you awake right now? And I can't think of a bigger example than Syria. So in Syria, we see the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, including the use of internationally banned weapons like cluster bombs. Detainees held by Syrian government forces are routinely subjected to torture, enforced disappearances, or extrajudicial executions. In the city of Aleppo, recently, Amnesty International found 9 cluster bombs. Because it disproportionately affects civilians. That's the reason why these weapons are bombed. And these weapons had been deliberately dropped onto a densely populated housing estate. Sabah, a 31-year-old woman who survived the carnage, talked about the losses just in her family alone. She had lost her 3 daughters, her mother, her husband, her sister, and 3 nephews. She asked, and I quote, "What is left for me in this life?" Sabah's family are amongst the tens of thousands who have died in the past 2 years. 60,000 by official UN count and counting. In Aleppo, the bodies of men and boys shot in the head, hands tied behind their backs, are recovered almost daily from the river. As these and other terrible stories make clear, we need a referral of the crimes committed in Syria to the International Criminal Court. So far, the UN Security Council and the international community has repeatedly looked away. Depressingly, as time has gone by and the world has failed to react, the abuses are increasingly not just by the government side, but also armed opposition groups in the country have regularly tortured or killed soldiers or civilians they have captured or abducted. In Afghanistan, and I want to just talk briefly about the whole issue of women's rights, which we are in the area of which we are facing some big challenges. In Afghanistan, some progress has been made, but violence against women remains endemic and goes largely unpunished. And this is the region that I come from, South Asia. So we were again talking inside before we came out about the whole situation with Malala, the little girl who was attacked because she was promoting girls' education. And in my country, India, I'm sure you all heard about the extremely horrific rape case in Delhi. Unfortunately, this case is not an exception. In fact, what happened in this case was that because it was in Delhi and because of the quick response of the media to get to the place where it happened, it got a lot of exposure both inside the country and internationally. But really the status of women across the world, but particularly in South Asia, is unbelievably atrocious, really. So again and again we see serious human rights violations against people simply because of who they are, their ethnic group, the color of their skin, their religious belief, their gender, their sexual orientation. And Uganda, I want to talk briefly about Uganda, is one of many countries in the world which sees high level of violence, harassment, and hatred directed towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Since 2009, the anti-homosexuality bill, which would entrench discrimination and hatred against LGBT people, has remained on the agenda. Not content with already existing provisions in the law for life imprisonment for homosexuality, the bill includes death penalty for persons who have consensual same-sex relations 3 times or more, or if a HIV-positive person has consensual same-sex, just once is enough. The bill would also make it compulsory for all members of society to report the existence of their LGBT loved ones or face up to 3 years in prison. In 2012, the Ugandan government threatened to kick out of the country numerous human rights organizations working to protect the rights of LGBT people. And over the past year, the police, under the direction of the Minister for Ethics and Integrity, have raided and broken up several human rights workshops and meetings in and around Kampala for LGBT activists. In fact, in December 2011, I think I was there in Kampala, and I met with a group of LGBT activists, including David Kato, who's a very well-known activist in Uganda. And just a few weeks after I left, he was shot dead. Sadly, he was one of the loudest voices for LGBT rights in Uganda. The LGBT activist Kasha Jacqueline had to flee one such workshop in order to avoid arrest. Kasha, who was expected to speak last week at Amnesty International's annual general meeting in Washington, faces constant death threats, as do many of those working with her. We in Amnesty International are humbled by Kasha's courage in standing up for the rights of LGBT Ugandans, and we are proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with her and other activists in the struggle for the rights of all. I might also briefly mention my recent visit to Nigeria. I'm just giving you some of the sort of worst cases across the world where we're seeing massive human rights violations. As you may be aware, in northern Nigeria, there's a new group which has come into being called Boko Haram, or at least it's new in terms of its visibility. And Boko Haram has single-handedly, sort of maimed, injured, or killed tens, if not hundreds of people in northern Nigeria. But our report, the one which I went to release there, was about the human rights violations which have been caused by the Nigerian security forces in their pursuit of curbing the actions of Boko Haram. So because of the actions of the Nigerian security forces, our sense is proportionally more people have lost their lives and more human rights violations have been caused in order to prevent Boko Haram's human rights abuses. And Nigeria, of course, has many other challenges it's facing. We have the situation with Shell and the big oil companies who continue to both environmentally damage through the oil spills in the Niger Delta region, but also through other forms of abuses to harm and abuse human rights of large sections of the population there. In cities like Port Harcourt and Lagos, we have a third dimension of human rights abuses, which is to forcibly evict poor communities who are living in land where they do not have secure tenures. And this is historically an injustice which has continued, but when I was there, we met with the governor of Lagos, and he fully justified the action, saying that these are all poor criminal people who should be thrown out of the land. Now, of course, it is within the rights of the government to carry out evictions, but forced evictions without following due process is not in line with international standards, and this is another big campaign that Amnesty is running right now. It's going to also be extended to places like Qatar, where we'll have the World Cup, but also in Rio, where both the World Cup and the Olympics will be happening in the near future. Now, of course, I could talk all night about different challenging issues, one of which is the crackdown on civil society in Russia. You may have seen the report, and Rebecca was highlighting this earlier to me. The New York Times, today's New York Times is talking about the raid on the Moscow office of Amnesty International, which happened in the last 2 days. And my response to Rebecca was that, yes, on the one hand, it's well within the law, within the power of the Russian authorities to come to the Amnesty office and check our records and audit the office, as they call it, because in any case, there's nothing for us which cannot be audited. They are very welcome to come and look at the records. But there are many small organizations who are going to be much more intimidated and harassed by these kind of actions, because it's basically a kind of muscle flexing exercise from the Russian government to say, we are watching you, and don't think you can get away by raising human rights questions here. So we have been fully cooperative, and we've shown them all the documentation. The question really is, what are they going to do after this? And more than for Amnesty International, our concern is how are they going to deal with smaller and less visible NGOs, which we are worried that they will force them to close down or harass the staff in these organizations. So, I can give you examples from Russia. You look at the crimes against humanity in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Since 1998, 5 million lives have been lost in Democratic Republic of Congo as a result of armed persecution and conflict. But I also want to focus this evening, as I said, I can give you a catalog of woes and challenges, but I also want to focus this evening on the reasons to take hope. And I want to give you examples of what this means in very practical terms. 50 years ago, when Amnesty International was created, critics described the idea of bringing people together to create unstoppable pressure for political change as one of the largest lunacies of our time. Amnesty was called one of our larger lunacies of our time. That so-called lunacy has, of course, proved capable of creating remarkable change. It all began with prisoners of conscience and letters which we were writing to release prisoners. And our Right for Rights campaign remains at the heart of our work even today. Of course, on the one hand, we have some very celebrated prisoners who we've helped release, like Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma. But the majority of Amnesty prisoners of conscience who are released, and are tens and tens of thousands of prisoners who have been released, are not names which you or I could recognize. They're just ordinary people fighting their daily struggle. Just last month, the Chinese authorities allowed Geng He, the wife of imprisoned human rights lawyer Gao Zhisheng, to visit him for the first time. It did not get him out of jail, but it was an important beginning. Geng He attributed the fact that she was allowed to visit to the pressure by Amnesty and others. And we thought that's an important victory. Thousands of prisoners of conscience have been also released because of similar pressures over the years. I have no doubt that we can see both Gao Zhisheng and the Nobel Prize-winning Liu Xiaobo and others set free if only enough pressure can be maintained. Former prisoners of conscience constantly talk of the importance of public pressure in ensuring that their cell doors are finally unlocked. Some of them are now our colleagues. In fact, Netsanet Bele, who is now Africa Research Director for Amnesty International, is somebody who I last met in a prison in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. In fact, we had 2 meetings with the deceased President Meles Zenawi to release Netsanet. And Netsanet is now out, and he's actually now the Director of Research in Amnesty International. In fact, paradoxically, the 2 NGO leaders who were incarcerated by Meles Zenawi are both now research directors, the other being Daniel Bekele, who's the research director for Human Rights Watch for the Africa division. So it's kind of interesting paradox. But I gave you, one real example of hope that's resulting from action which we've been able to generate, people's action. But take the question of international justice. In the past, those who committed war crimes and genocide knew they would never be punished. The Pol Pots and the Pinochets of this world knew that there was no place where they could be charged. That's all changed. There are war crimes tribunals for Rwanda and the Balkans, and crucially, we now have an international criminal court authorized to prosecute crimes against humanity and genocide around the world. We were told it was unachievable, but it has become real. Because of the pressure of human rights activists working in extraordinary global coalition. The Global Coalition for the International Criminal Court really brought together a whole mix of people, including sympathetic diplomats who understood what we were trying to do. A permanent international court was established, and with 122 governments signing up to it, the global reach of the court is now firmly entrenched. Once upon a time, just a few years ago, it all looked so different. George W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, said that it was his proudest moment when he unsigned the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. The US went on to launch a global campaign to undermine the ICC, but that campaign failed. In the words of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, the government, quote, shot itself in the foot. In 2011, interestingly enough, the Security Council referred the case of Libya to the International Criminal Court, and this time the US co-sponsored and voted in favor of the resolution, which was adopted unanimously by the Council. And in the meantime, the Democratic Republic of Congo and a clutch of other countries are also on the court's docket. Just in recent days, last week in fact, we saw Bosco Ntaganda hand himself in the US Embassy in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. Ntaganda, of course, is a well-known warlord, stands accused of crimes against humanity in the long war in the Congo. For years after his indictment, he clearly believed he was beyond the reach of law, and he remained living freely in eastern Congo, flaunting what he believed to be his impunity. Now, Ntaganda is in The Hague. Of course, we're not entirely there. The ICC faces many challenges. Not all states are providing cooperation to the ICC. Even governments like Chad have allowed Sudanese President Bashir to visit their countries without arresting and surrendering him to the ICC. These are challenges that Amnesty International and many of you will continue to confront as we support the realization of an effective system of international justice. Crucially, however, governments and citizens alike now understand the power of accountability for crimes committed. That is a huge and important change. Let me talk about another big success. Not least through our Demand Dignity campaign, Amnesty International has sought to ensure the indivisibility of rights, civil and political on the one side and economic, social on the other. It's acknowledged now not just as a piece of rhetoric, but as a reality. The My Body, My Rights campaign that Amnesty International launched last month is the latest example of how we are seeking to make that real. And we reached a historic milestone earlier this year when 2 more governments, Portugal and Uruguay, ratified the optional protocol on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. That means that the optional protocol will come into force in a few weeks' time, on 5th of May. But what does this mean in practice? It means that for the first time, we have the chance of a global complaints mechanism where domestic remedies have been exhausted. In other words, governments can be held to account for the first time for economic, social, and cultural rights, not just for civil political rights at the international level. The US has sadly failed to ratify even the main International Covenant on Economic Social Rights, never mind the optional protocol. But the global trend is clear. For my final example of achievable change, I want to describe an important turning point that we have just reached. Proved to be historic indeed. Until now, there has been no regulation of international arms flows. Even the flow of bananas are regulated across the world, but not the most dangerous and harmful things that human beings ever made, which is arms and ammunition. The new arms trade treaty, which is being negotiated in New York as we speak, could change all that. The treaty can make it illegal for arms and ammunition to be traded with countries where there is a substantial risk that these weapons can be used to commit human rights violations. That change can save countless lives in the years to come. I have in fact just traveled from New York, where the final talks of the UN are going on for the proposed agreement, and this is a culmination of 20 years of campaigning by Amnesty International and many other civic actors. The arms trade treaty is a huge opportunity for the world. We need to make sure that we seize it. And that, of course, must include the United States. Yet one more issue where the unimaginable could become real. Now, I should take 2 minutes to just talk about the role of the United States in the arms trade treaty, since this is a US audience. The positive sign is that unlike the Bush administration, the Obama administration has accepted that the world will benefit from an arms trade treaty, so it's a step forward. Unfortunately, they are not ready at this point to sign up to some of the crucial provisions which are needed in order to make this treaty a truly preventive treaty. So Amnesty's call is that if we fully know that a government or a non-governmental actor, a non-state actor, is likely to use this for abusing human rights, in that case, our view is that the arms should not be sent to any such party. The view which is being put forward by the US government is that only if there is a knowledge of the party, of the state party or a non-state party going to be using the arms, and that they actually state explicitly clarify an intent to use the arms for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Only under those circumstances should arms be prohibited from reaching these parties. Now, this is a threshold which is so high that the chances of it being reached are very, very low. So if you take the example of Syria, for example, in the case of Syria, 3,300 lives had to be lost before the UN Security Council put an arms embargo on the Assad regime getting arms. Now, and that's a kind of, the UN arms embargo is what we call a body bag approach, which is that hundreds of people have to die, and then after the deaths have happened, then the UN reacts. Whereas this treaty is trying to prevent arms from reaching people who are going to abuse arms for human rights violations. So we could easily, the world knows as to which are the countries which are likely to abuse human rights and is already starting to, and when we say abuse of human rights, we're not talking in vague terms, we're talking about governments who are using torture, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, and it's not that difficult to imagine which these countries are. So in our view, once we are in full knowledge that these people have had a tendency and a record of human rights abuses, then arms should not reach those countries. So in this case, the Assad regime would never have been given arms if we had a threshold that we are proposing. The second argument which the US government is putting forward is that ammunition should not be included in the treaty. Then they're giving many reasons why they think it should not be included, because they feel it's too detailed, they do not have the capacity to monitor the movement of ammunitions. But The African countries are very clear. There are too many guns in Africa and in many developing countries. There is no way in which the guns can be taken back by the government. The only way that you can prevent the use of these guns is by preventing ammunition from reaching the owners of these guns. So there's a big battle going on right now, and by Thursday evening, the arms trade treaty has to be finalized. We have a website called clickboom.org. So please, we need your voice. We need American voices to tell the American government that they have to sign a treaty which is what we are calling bulletproof. The NRA is doing everything to make sure that this treaty cannot be signed. They're spreading a pack of lies, which we have explained in great detail on our website. You can see it, because this treaty has nothing to do with national domestic arms flow inside the US. Much as we may not like it, that's a different question. This is an international treaty which has no bearing on domestic issues. Rebecca and the American Bar Association has been very good on talking about this, and I'm sure, Rebecca, you can say much more about how this treaty has no bearing on domestic arms flows. So I just wanted to highlight this because it's a very important and it's very current, and you could do something about it, so I wanted to spend a couple of more minutes on this. Now, of course, the complex diplomacy process which has led to the agreement in arms trade, on an arms trade treaty, or which we hope will lead to an agreement, includes reminders of how power in the world has shifted in a way that provides us with important new challenges and opportunities in shaping the human rights landscape of the future. Some of the key meetings that I had in New York last week were not just with the ambassadors of the rich countries, the P5. The permanent 5 members of the Security Council, I should let you know, account for more than 50% of the arms trade in the world. The US alone is the single biggest exporter of arms by far. It's a $70 billion industry. So you can imagine all the actors who are involved in influencing or preventing a treaty to come about. But interestingly, the way the UN is functioning now, I have to meet not just the ambassadors of the P5 countries, but very important to meet ambassadors of Brazil, India, South Africa, and all the new emerging powers. These countries now have a key role to play, which complements that of the traditional power base of the P5. And that's partly why Amnesty International is now embarking on deepening our presence in these emerging economies. Voices from Washington, Paris, London can link together. When I say voices, I'm talking about people's voices. Grassroots voices can link together with the voices from the global south to become a truly unstoppable global force for human rights. To give just one example of what this means in practice, Amnesty International has recently set up a base in India, and within the first 6 months of our existence in that country, we have been able to gather more than 1 million signatures to create pressure for an inquiry into the final stages of what happened in the so-called war in Sri Lanka in 2009, when tens of thousands of civilians, mostly Tamils, were killed in a few short months. That in turn contributed towards the passing of an important US-led resolution on Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council in Geneva last week, which demands more investigation of the crimes committed by the government forces and Tamil Tigers alike at the time. So just a few years ago, of course, the United States was described as a hyperpower and the sole force in the world. But this, of course, I think if you look at the next 20 years at least, the US will remain hugely influential, but it's not on its own anymore. All of us in this room know all too well human rights violations are a key issue also inside this country. So I want to spend a few minutes on talking about the domestic challenges that this country faces in human rights terms. And let me start with drones, Guantanamo, and accountability for torture. Now, human rights violations in the name of national security as part of the global war legal theory developed under President Bush and adopted by President Obama that claims that the whole world is a battlefield and international human rights do not apply. Essentially, the USA has asserted the exclusive right unilaterally to define the war and make up its own rules. US drone strikes have killed thousands, yet this program remains shrouded in secrecy. The little we do know raises deep concerns about extrajudicial executions. We need the administration to release more information about this killing program and start following the international rules that already exist. Despite all the promises, Guantanamo remains open, and the administration has not only failed to live up to the commitment to close this facility, it has adopted the policies of indefinite detention and military commissions. Those still detained must either be charged and fairly tried in federal court or be released to countries that respect their human rights. I'm sure those of you who follow the Guantanamo Bay issue, it's over the 11-year period or so, I think 800 detainees have passed through the Guantanamo Bay. Only 7 of them have been convicted so far. Barack Obama seemed clear-cut in his condemnation of torture before he became president in 2008. And I quote him saying, "We will reject torture without exception or equivocation." And yet we still see reluctance by the Obama administration to bring to account those who authorized torture in the first place in the Bush era. To their credit, the Obama administration has stopped what is called enhanced interrogation techniques, which is basically torture. Officially, it's now it's outside the legal framework. It's illegal, and they've also closed the so-called black sites. But arguments in favor of torture, say waterboarding, are not just morally flawed, but also erroneously make the issue about effectiveness. As far as Amnesty International, and I hope everybody in this room is concerned, torture is wrong. It will always be wrong, and there must be consequences for those who practice torture. The US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence recently adopted the findings of its investigations into torture, which is an important development. Now, if that report is made public, that will be a beginning of the openness which Amnesty International has been repeatedly calling for. But we are not seeing that yet. Public support for that aim will continue to be important. And then, of course, there's the death penalty, the ultimate violation of the right to life. The United States continues to be one of the world's leading executioners, which puts it in the company of countries like China, North Korea, and Iran. In 2012, California almost became a part of the global trend towards abolition, narrowly voting last year to maintain the death penalty. But I'm convinced that change will come in due course in California as well. As Rose Seabird, who survived an attack from a serial killer who killed 5 other women, rightly noted, and I quote, "How can we say with credibility that murder is abhorrent, an abomination, and then turn around and commit the act ourselves?" 6 states, including Maryland, have abandoned capital punishment in the last 6 years. Death sentences have dropped to historic lows. Executions are not likely to resume anytime soon in California, and more states are likely to repeal their death penalty laws in the coming years. Amnesty International will not give up the struggle here, just as we'll continue to fight against the death penalty in those other countries which use it the most. Now, I want to just talk briefly about some of the double standards we're facing in the US. So despite the above concerns, the US on the one hand can still be a valuable global... Can I just have a sip? So despite the above concerns, the US can still be a valuable global voice on human rights. But, and here's an important but, the US must always indeed speak out for human rights. We must never let US policy become, to quote the old presidential phrase, a question of, and I hope I'm not breaching some World Affairs Council rules when I say this, but let me quote what a US president apparently once said, that he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. So Chileans, Argentines, and many others around the world suffered quite enough from that approach in past years. One might hope that attitude, which is that if they're on our side, never mind about their trampling of human rights, would long since have been dumped in the trash can of history. Sadly, that's not the way it's been. Over recent decades, we saw how the US was ready to back President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt with scant regard for his appalling track record on human rights. Even Saddam Hussein, after all, for a long period, was a good friend of Washington when he seemed useful 25 years ago and when he was committing some of his worst crimes. Even today, the US remains largely silent on continuing human rights violations in Egypt. It continues to sell weapons to the country despite overwhelming evidence that they are used to commit human rights abuse against protesters. Or take the case of Saudi Arabia. Abdullah al-Hamid and Mohammed al-Qahtani are leading human rights activists in Saudi Arabia. They have worked closely with Amnesty International. They're co-founders of the Saudi Civil and Political Rights Association, which helps many families of detainees held without charge or trial. This month, their reward for this important work was that they themselves were jailed. They received 5 and 10-year sentences respectively. They stand accused of a list of crimes, which can be summed up as saying that they dared to exercise their right to freedom of expression. Given all this, when Secretary of State John Kerry went to Saudi Arabia recently, shortly after their sentences were handed down, we might have expected that he would speak out on these violations of basic rights. Instead, he spoke, and I quote, of encouraging further inclusive reforms, without any reference to the existing problems. So bully messages like this do nothing for the citizens and the people of Saudi Arabia who dare to dream of a better society than the unjust society they live in now. Take Bahrain. 2 years after a popular uprising rocked the country, prisoners of conscience, including some arrested during the protests, remain behind bars. The rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly continue to be suppressed. As the jailed and tortured Ibrahim Sharif told Amnesty International researcher, the punishment is against all those who dare to speak out. And I quote, freedom has a price, he says, and we know we are paying a small price compared to those who died. Just a few days ago in Washington, I was privileged to meet again with Farida Ghulam, wife of Ibrahim Sharif, for whose freedom Amnesty International continues to campaign. Farida spoke powerfully this weekend at Amnesty's annual general meeting in Washington. Until recently, however, the US government has stayed almost silent on the continuing abuses in Bahrain, surely partly because of the big defense base that they have there. Even now, it's failing to press the demands for basic concessions like the release of prisoners of conscience. We need freedom for Ibrahim Sharif, and we need the US to speak out on his behalf and on behalf of others like him. So let me conclude. The challenges are many, but it would be very wrong to feel that that's how it always will be. No, in fact, quite the opposite. Things can change, and they have changed, and they will change, as the examples above make clear. When Amnesty International started its campaign against torture in the 1970s, we were told we could never achieve a global ban, but we did. The UN Convention Against Torture became a cornerstone of the human rights world, badly needed in recent years. When Amnesty and others campaigned for the creation of the International Criminal Court, the skeptics told us it would never happen. When Amnesty started working on the death penalty, only 16 countries in the world rejected the idea of killing people as an appropriate form of justice. Now 140 countries are abolitionist in law or practice, and that number is growing every year. And last but not least, we can achieve a strong arms trade treaty this week and save millions of lives if enough people here and around the world make sure that this piece of paper gains real practical force. So it's important for us to recognize the challenges, but there are also countless opportunities for change. We must never lose sight of this. In fact, the motto which we use inside Amnesty is that if ordinary people coming together can create extraordinary change. And in fact, the Amnesty candle, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, I'm sure you know what the history of the candle is, or the sort of the backdrop, the meaning of the candle is, and that comes from that famous saying that you have two choices. You can either curse the darkness or you can light a candle. So we certainly go for the light the candle option, and I hope you'll join us in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and may your candle burn brightly for many, many years to come. You're such a wonderful voice. There are many questions here. You did a fabulous job of summing up international human rights activism in a very short period of time, and there are still a lot of other topics people would like for you to address. One I'd like to raise is based on an article, again, that was in the New York Times just this morning, reporting a comment of a police general and legislator out of Cairo who said, quote, "Sometimes a girl contributes 100% to her own raping when she puts herself in these conditions." And the conditions that he was referring to was the exercise, of course, of their political rights to demonstrate in public space. You've addressed some issues regarding the rights of women and violence against women in the exercise of their political rights. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more detail about what's going on in the Middle East in that issue. And also there was a specific question on the response of Amnesty International to the rape in India.
So, I mean, since you're, sorry, since the example you've, is this working?
Needs to be close.
Frozen? Okay. I could go there first. Since the example you've quoted is from Egypt, maybe I should just kick off with, one of the conversations I had with the Supreme Council of Armed Forces in my last visit to Cairo. This was after the revolution and before the elections had happened. As you know, the country was being ruled by SCAF, or the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. So we went, the mission, the Amnesty team went to Tahrir Square, met with the protesters, but we also met with Samira Ibrahim, who was one of the women protesters who had been then taken into a military detention camp, and along with several other women. And before they were released, they had to go through virginity tests. And so obviously, Samira herself was in a very bad state, but she was only one of the 20 women who was ready to go public on this issue. And so we did have an interview with her. We just tried to understand what the testimony was. And immediately after that, we went to meet the SCAF general, who, by the way, Sanusi is now in the new President Morsi regime. He's the new Minister for Defense. He was the head of military intelligence at SCAF. And known to be, amongst the old military generals of Mubarak, Sanusi was known to be one of the more upright generals, more honest, more, less corrupt, etc. So maybe for that reason, they wanted him to front the meeting with Amnesty International. So I met with him and asked him, why exactly are you doing this virginity testing? Now, the interesting thing is, instead of denying that they're doing, he gave me doing what he was doing. He gave me an elaborate explanation as to why they do it. This, of course, then got recorded by the press, and then the Cairo High Court then ordered for the Egyptian military to stop virginity testing completely. But the mindset is what I want to talk about, and that goes to the article you're referring to, because so President Sanusi, the military general's argument was that if we don't do virginity testing and this woman goes out of the military detention camp and she's found to not to be a virgin anymore, then the soldiers are going to be accused of having raped the woman, which frankly was such a complex argument, convoluted thinking. So then we said, but what is this argument? Then he said, no, you don't understand Egyptian culture. So we said, but Samira Ibrahim is Egyptian. She doesn't seem to understand, she can't understand what this has got to do with Egyptian culture either. But fortunately, the courts then, put an end to it, and they have completely, at least that's what they claim, that they're not doing virginity testing anymore. But very often, these things, and in the case of this, the argument which is in that article, in my country has been very often used, and I think anybody from South Asia would be able to recognize it, that whenever there's a rape, the first thing they will say is, what did that woman do? She must have provoked it. Something she did must have caused it. And in the Delhi rape as well, many, many questions were asked. In my city, in Mangalore, in the southwest coast, there is a sort of, I don't know what they call themselves, it's kind of an extension of a Hindu right-wing group, but it's kind of a moral brigade. They go around testing what kind of clothes women are wearing, are they staying out late at night, and if they do, they actually attack the women. So on the one hand, on the issue of women's rights, there's a long-term, deep piece of work that we have to do in terms of changing societal behavior, attitude, and approaches, etc. Because the status of women, particularly in South Asia, is easily one of the worst in the world, and it's very ingrained with religious beliefs as well. So that's on the one hand. But as far as Amnesty International is concerned, our view is that of course, we will keep doing, creating human rights education to create a rights-respecting society is the long-term work that Amnesty does. But in the meantime, we're not going to wait for 2 generations before we put an end to women's oppression and to the violation of women's rights. And there, the role of the state is so important. So in the case of India, Amnesty International gave a submission to the Justice Verma Committee, and so we do have an anti-rape law now, which we think is grossly inadequate, but it's better than anything we've had before. And but this is not a problem only in India, Egypt, or the Malala case in Pakistan. This is very widespread.
Could you explain with a little more detail how Amnesty works? Obviously, you're talking to state actors and so forth, but what sort of work is being done actually on the ground by Amnesty?
So, the way in which Amnesty works is that we have 4 elements to, how we try to bring about change. So the foundation or the bedrock of everything Amnesty does is based on research. So we spend a lot of time and energy to make sure that we get our facts right. So the evidence gathering, the research has to be independent and impartial. So we have a team of 200-300 researchers who focus on just fact gathering. And most of it is done on a primary basis. We don't rely on secondary sources. So the work is done by direct testimonials, interviews, spending time in the field. Beyond that, of course, we do work with a wide range of partners, particularly in countries like North Korea or places where we have no access. Then we have to find other ways of getting the information. But research is at the heart of what we do. Now, building on the research, the second piece is the campaigning. And the campaigning is primarily, of course, I'm talking about the media-based campaigns to create more visibility and pressure using the media. The third is the lobbying, because we then talk to governments, both the governments who are the perpetrators, but also governments who have influence over the perpetrators. So in this case, for example, if you take a country like Iran, which is very difficult to penetrate, we might talk to the Brazilians who may have some influence over the Iranians, whereas if the Americans go and talk to the Iranians, they're not going to listen. So we try and find out ways in which, who are these governments going to listen to? But then the fourth element comes in, which is really the heart of what Amnesty does, which is the grassroots people-based campaigning. So our 3 million plus members, they put pressure. And I've just come back from Washington where we had a big rally on the Arms Trade Treaty outside the White House. And that's our membership and our students and our campus groups coming together to put pressure. And that's just in the US, to give you one example, but it happens all over the world. So in the Arms Trade Treaty negotiations right now, for example, we have a 30-member delegation from different parts of the world. So our team from the Middle East will be talking to the governments from the Middle East. Our teams from Latin America will talk to the governments from Latin America. So they feel international pressure on an international process.
That's wonderful. Let me ask you about 2 countries in particular. China, particularly how they've dealt with the Falun group. And secondly, Mali. What is Amnesty International's involvement in the situation in Mali?
Well, I think China is we'll need a whole different session to talk about China, because on the one hand, there has been, given the transition and the changes which are happening in China right now, the political transition that's going on, there has been a crackdown on dissidents, on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all of the traditional areas that Amnesty works on. We have seen a worsening of the repressive actions of the state in the last year or 2. But if you take a longer view, and this was one of the things which happened when I was asked to attend on behalf of Liu Xiaobo's family, I attended the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. We had the empty chair in the ceremony because Liu was not allowed to travel, and neither was his wife. But at that time, a lot of the journalists were asking me, saying, the Chinese government is now putting pressure on ambassadors from different countries not to attend the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, to boycott it, and what's your view on it? And my view was that actually that's a good sign. because when Dalai Lama got the Peace Prize, they didn't even bother about it. And they said, okay, who cares about the Nobel Peace Prize? But now they're starting to care about it. They're starting to care about how the world sees China, partly because they're starting to trade more in Africa, and they're starting to have to play using the global rules. So we're in a different situation. But I mean, there's still many challenges. You talked about Falun Gong. We have the Uyghur issue, the Muslim minority issue, of course, the Tibetans more broadly. So there's no shortage of challenges. But I feel that given the internet, the opening of the internet, even in China, I was with a group of 12 Chinese students just last week, and there are thousands of Chinese students studying now in the US. They're running a whole program of exposure, and of course their view is that these people should learn English and get exposed and come back. But the fact is that when these kids go out and when they're on the internet, they're picking up a lot more. All those kids knew about Amnesty International. They were so interested in talking to me about human rights and all these issues. So I think that there's a lot of internal turmoil that's going on, and there's no way in which they can continue to open up only the economy and not the political system. I'm trying to, I feel a bit strange covering China in 2 minutes and then going to Mali. But I guess that's what we have to do with the time we have. But Mali is, the Mali story is, I think, actually interestingly very linked to the question of the Arms Trade Treaty, because it's not as if there was no Tuareg problem or Islamist problem in Mali before. It was always there, but it was much lower scale and much lower profile, till what happened in Libya and in the north of Africa. So once we had the Gaddafi being overturned and that whole crisis in North Africa, there's been a massive flow of arms and so-called mercenaries who came back into Mali. And interestingly enough, these arms in Mali, which have come, quite a lot of it has come from Libya, have originally been supplied by Italy. Berlusconi making deals of arms for oil with Gaddafi. And we've been able to trace, even in northern Nigeria, that many of these arms have actually come from the big changes which have happened in North Africa. So, in concrete terms, we have the same problem in Mali, which we are seeing in Cote d'Ivoire and other places. Both sides have committed human rights abuses. We've done extensive documentation on the ground. We've produced several reports on Mali, and it's very good that the ICC is going to be involved now, and that the West African forces are more involved, but it's a long-term problem. I don't think that the solution in the Sahel are going to come through a French, intervention, which it's just fine for a short-term relief, but I don't think there's any long-term solution which we're going to get from this.
Let's switch to a different subject matter, which is the issue of economic rights. And if you could talk a little bit more about Amnesty International's approach on socioeconomic issues and how those rights are protected, specifically whether or not the organization has addressed, for instance, the right to representation in civil cases.
Well, conceptually, this is an ongoing debate as to, the Charter, the Universal Declaration says that these rights are indivisible, interdependent, but what it means in practice has always been a challenge. And the example I always give is of Mohamed Bouzizi, the vegetable vendor in Tunisia. Some of you may have remembered his case where he set himself on fire in Sidi Bouziz in Tunisia. And so the question that was going through my mind was did he set himself on fire because he was denied civil political rights or economic social rights? What was going through his mind? Did he carve it out in those two covenants before he did that? Because the fact of the matter is that the guy was not even allowed to sell his vegetables. He was trying to get a license and he got slapped by a police, and he felt a complete loss of dignity. So on the one hand, it was unemployment and the fact that it was an economic issue. On the other hand, it was a dignity and repression of his civic voice. And I always say that in most developing countries, it's the poor who have no voice, and it's those who have no voice who are poor. So the two go completely together. Somebody asked me when I first took this job, so are you going to focus the work in India on police atrocities, or are you going to focus it on poverty? So I asked that person, who's a very well-known civil rights activist in this country, so I asked him whether he's ever been to a police station in India. So he said, no. So I said, for my sins, I've spent quite a lot of time in police stations in India. I can tell you no rich person ever goes to a police station. It's always poor people. Look at the prisons in this country. It's not exactly the rich and influential in any of these prisons. So there's a very strong correlation between class and race and class and violation or denial of civil political rights. So I think Amnesty's work is focused in two areas. One is on the sharply focused on the question of corporate accountability. I talked about the work we're doing in the Niger Delta on Shell, for example, or in the case of Vedanta, which is the bauxite mining company in India, of course, long-term work on Bhopal and the gas tragedy in India. So a lot of these questions of companies abusing the rights, particularly of indigenous people, but of all different groups who are disempowered. And the other piece of work we've been looking at is sexual reproductive rights, particularly maternal mortality. But each of these we could spend a lot more time. I'm trying to give you just some headlines. So.
And are you working with any organizations on the issue of representation, legal representation of persons in asserting these rights?
I'm not sure I'm not sure of the answer to that. We do work with a wide range of partners, but I wouldn't be able to give you a precise answer on that.
Well, on the issue of partners, who have you found to be among your most effective partners in the issue, in the international human rights field?
Well, we work with a wide range. Human Rights Watch we work, and we have a very good practical way in which we work with them. So, for example, in the case of Egypt, what we said was that we will cover Suez and Alexandria in the midst of the crisis when they focus more on Cairo. So we have a very practical division of labor. But we work a lot with very local organizations and human rights defenders, community groups, because they are on the ground, so we rely on them a lot. But we work with ICG, we work with ICRC, all of the big actors, we work very closely with them.
And as you noticed earlier, there are a number of young people here in the audience, and we've gotten many questions on how they can become involved in with Amnesty International work, and what would best prepare them to do work in the international human rights activist field.
I think, Amnesty International is like a gold mine. It's full of information, full of activists, full of young people. So all you need to do is to just connect with them, and you'll find that it opens up an amazing set of doors and a window into the human rights world. We've got colleagues here, Gail is sitting there and Hannah there. So if any of you are they're both in San Francisco. They're based in an office here. So if you guys are located here, do talk to them. Of course, you can always visit our website. But how you can get involved, I would say, some of you may be already studying these subjects and you're following it more closely. So I think getting a clear understanding of the issues is the most important thing to start with. And once you're more aware of the issues or you have a perspective, then I think the more you can be active. The thing is that the fact of the matter is that even the best governments in the world, even if you think the Obama administration is, which I think is easy to think is way better than what you had before, they need to be kept in check. They need to feel that people are watching them, that we are monitoring them, we're holding them accountable. That's so important. So your voice, your pressure from the grassroots, at the end of the day, that's the only thing they listen to. And if you're doing it in large enough numbers, because nothing is stopping you from doing that by yourself anyway, because that's great, you should do it. But the thing about Amnesty and social movements like Amnesty is that we bring it together. So there's a collective voice and an organized voice, and that makes a big difference, because you do it alone, it'll have a certain amount of impact. But if you're doing it as a collective, and you're doing it with a kind of a global brand that Amnesty brings, a credibility, then it has a multiplier impact.
Thank you. So perhaps as the last question, you talked about what keeps you up. Let me ask you, what keeps you going?
That's an easy one to answer, because I'm in this very strange situation where it's a great privilege to be doing this job with Amnesty International. So one day, you're talking to head of state, head of the UN, and that could be sometimes inspiring, but rarely so. The most inspiring meetings are really when you meet a lot of young activists on the ground, and particularly when you meet human rights defenders and prisoners who've come out of the prison. Like I met recently a Russian prisoner of conscience, Igor Sutygin, and he was telling me how those letters from Amnesty International really made that prison warden more careful about how he dealt with him. So it's not that he was released, but they're a bit more careful when they're treating people. Apparently, this guy was asking Igor, you seem to have friends in all different parts of the world. Who are all these people writing letters to you, from Germany and Sweden and Brazil? And so he said, I don't know any of them. They're just Amnesty members. So that's very inspiring. You just feel like, yes, we can do this.
Well, thank you, and we really appreciate your remarks this evening. So, thank you very much. Salil, of course, will be available for any other questions because there were a number that we weren't able to answer here this evening. And thank you all very much for being here. Appreciate your interest.